All right, we're broadcasting live now, and a few moments here, people will start logging in. It is Wednesday, October 20th, and I am virtually at the beach in Carmel, California, but not really. I'm in San Marcos, Texas. It is a beautiful day. Winter or the fall is just coming in, and things are looking really nice. The weather is looking really nice, and we're excited to have a great guest with us today. And folks are starting to sign up. And John Butler is ready for some opening music. How's that?
If I could save time in a bottle, the first thing that I like to do is to save every day like a treasure, and then again I would spend them with you.
Excellent, Johnny.
Hold on. Bravo, bravo, bravo.
Thank you, thank you. John, how are you, sir? How are you doing today?
I'm just fine in Austin, Texas, going about my great daily work of writing articles and writing papers. Had a great MBA class this morning, and talked some about technology transfer and funding the firm. But more importantly, I think that things are trying to bounce back now of all the things that we've talked about. I can see a bit of stirring of people in the air. Of course, we still have the political parameters around here about who should wear a mask and who should not wear a mask. But it looks like all of the festivals for Austin, Texas are coming back. It looks like the city is booming. I had dinner last night at the Vince Young Steakhouse, and it was booming. So I'm doing well, Andres. How are you doing today?
Good, good, really good, really good. Thanks, John. We'll come back in a moment to you, and let me say hi to Llewelyn. Llewelyn, how are you, sir?
Well, thank you. Things are booming here too. You can't get in the restaurant. They can't get any help, and you can't get in. It must be all this money that people saved, all the just pent up demand to be social. I told you about masks. I went down to your conference and everybody was wearing masks. I went to a reception in Washington and nobody was wearing masks. So, the idea that Texas is alone in its resistance isn't actually true. The reception was at the Uzbekistan embassy, and no one, including all the American guests, were wearing masks. Linda and I were. We looked like idiots, but we felt better about it afterwards.
Right. Yeah, makes sense. And we have a great guest today. So, George Karayannis, how are you, sir?
Andres, I am fantastic. Thank you very much for having me this week.
Well, thank you for joining us, and I'm looking forward to you giving us an update of where you're at and what's going on in the smart cities world. But before that, let me introduce you formally for those who don't know you. George Karayannis is the North American Smart Cities lead at Honeywell, and he's graciously enough giving us some time today while he's at Smart Cities Connect in Washington, D.C. And Honeywell obviously is a very well-known name. I think most of you don't know introduction to that, but they happen to have smart city solutions, and they have a unique, great platform, sort of single pane glass that controls all kinds of devices and elements in a portfolio of buildings and blocks and cities and all kinds of things. So, being the multinational they are, global company, great technology. Prior to Honeywell, George was a VP of Strategic Sales at VIX Technologies, VP of City now at Panasonic, VP of US Smart City Solutions at Schneider Electric, Energy Business Development Leader at Lockheed Martin, Director of US Utility Sales at Regen Energy, Executive Director at Energize America, and many, many other roles. George has been doing the smart cities connected automation thing for a long time, and we're lucky to have him to share his insights and wisdom and all the cool things that he's doing now with Honeywell. He happens to have a business, a a degree in a Bachelor of Arts in Marketing and Public Relations for the University of Dayton, and an MBA from Case Western Reserve University. Welcome again, George.
Andres, thank you. And I am joining you, as you said, from Smart Cities Connect conference in National Harbor, just outside DC. It's good to be back at in-person events. It is a county mandated indoor mask mandate. So the attendees are indoors, all masked up. That's why I stepped outside to support the webinar. And it creates an interesting dynamic that I think we simply need to get more comfortable with going into the future, because it won't only be COVID-19. There will be other pandemics. We finally learned to mask up, at least to some degree. And so people are thrilled to be back in person, and the masks at the same time, it's hard to read facial expressions, right? So it's this interesting hybrid event that we're working through in real time, I guess, as a culture, as we rebound and as the country opens back up.
Yeah, and actually, I want to piggyback on that a little bit and get your intake. I mean, COVID has been an incredible experience. We tend to talk about COVID even from the very early days, that it was going to be a catalyst for the digitalization and acceleration of how automation was far more important and taken seriously by many industry sectors. And one of the interesting things about COVID, and perhaps your journey in kind of global perspective, you work for the Japanese, you work for the French, you travel all over the world. And, I think America is a little different when it comes to all these issues, right? I mean, like Asians and other cultures are a lot more protective of the common good and following rules and things like that. And what's your take on a little bit of the journey that you have seen on how we deal with the pandemic, sort of globally versus the US, for example?
I think a good example is, I recall reading something, New Zealand and Australia, many countries had 95% compliance with mask mandates, right? Upper 90% compliance. And the US was much closer to 50%, just culturally. And, that had implications as a result of it. I also want to clarify, I am participating in speaking today as George Karayannis, not officially on behalf of Honeywell. I'm not making global pandemic statements on behalf of Honeywell. Just clear that up.
I know.
So, but to your earlier point, Andres, it has shifted the delivery of city services,
right,
to increasingly digital, and I don't think we will go back. Right. That if we're doing this properly.
Yeah, absolutely. You guys had a question?
Yeah, I had a question. It's interesting. I taught in Japan for 14 summers, and I taught in China. And even this was years ago, and everybody wore masks. All of the taxi drivers wore masks. Many people wore masks as they moved around in their daily life. So going back to the mask question, George, I think it's a matter of culture. And I wonder when we switch to that culture prerogative of wearing masks, because we know that some of the unintended consequences have been less colds, less flu, right? And so it's very, very interesting to see and track how Americans will respond to the maskless. But the other thing, it has become political here, George. It's almost a political event here. But I just wanted to make that comment on the internationalization and the culture of masks that you were talking about at your convention there.
It seems, if I could add something there, it seems that the politicization extends to Western Europe. Masks are a big issue on the continent, and they're a big issue in Britain. So there's something about the culture, the Western culture, that is more resistant than the Eastern cultures.
Yeah. I also, I'll be remiss not to plug in what I always said, being a Latin culture, of blood bearing, that, I tell everybody that stop hugging and kissing abuelito and abuelita, this notion of hugging and kissing all over the Latin culture is really not a good predicament for pandemics. So, again, it's really an important thing to change our behavior and to maintain, health. And so I think that, as you said, George, I don't think that any of these things are going to change, and there may be other pandemics, and we just need to adjust to a new reality. So tell us a little bit, because we're curious, first big event on smart cities. You were at Digital 360 Summit with us and keynoted. Thank you very much for that again, and bringing your team and all that. Tell us what how many folks are attending this event, and is there anything new, any new technologies, anything other than perhaps Honeywell greatest and best technology? Anything worth sharing?
I would say the keynote, I would estimate close to 1,000 people. And so that's, that's encouraging. So, several hundred for sure. And the breakouts, sadly, it's like every conference, work never stops. So you try to go to a conference and your day job just keeps hounding you. But I haven't had a chance to walk the expo floor to see what is new in terms of industry updates. We just issued a press release. We have won the city of Bangalore Smart City project, valued at roughly 65 million US. And I would use that to emphasize that the global smart cities market continues to be to mature or evolve at a different rate outside North America, right? We are in first gear still in North America, and in India, Middle East, Africa, China, they're in third, if not fourth gear. And so how do we help US, North American cities move beyond pilots to full-scale deployments, right? That issue, I think, is at the forefront of the smart cities market in North America. Mm-hmm. How do we find the business model and the decision-making process that will advance beyond incrementalism?
Right.
Yeah, I think, let me ask you this, George. I think if you look at, I think Honeywell has because I do research on smart cities for the last number of years. I think Honeywell has a turnkey solution for the management of the platform. And George, you hit it right there on the head. What are the business models? Whether it's the deployment of the workforce, whether it's the management of red lights, whether it's the management of traffic, whether it's the management of the zoo, or wherever else there are sensors. And one of the things I think that will really, really blossom, and something that Andreas and I have worked with in our space, is creating those business models with data. Will it all be about the data itself? Will it be real time like the stock market? So I've always said, to the extent that the stock market is constantly changing, to what extent can we create the analog of the stock market for a smart city? So the traffic is constantly there for managers to see. What's happening at the zoo is constantly there for managers to see. Who's coming and leaving the city? All of those sensors will allow us to write the equations for that. How do you think about the business models for Honeywell or any other firm that's interested in telling cities, in Andrea's words, you just don't have to write tickets and make money from the zoo? What do you think? How do you think about the business models in the aggregate, that is?
Well, certainly cities want to increase revenues and they want to monetize data where they can. And I think there are a few opportunities to do that, while at the same time cities understand and respect their civic duty of using data to operate the city more. If they can reduce cost of trash collection or street maintenance 10, 20%, that is saving citizens taxpayer money. they really get on thin ice when they start trying to monetize data, because that's really something that a private enterprise is better suited for. The city has an obligation to protect its citizens and to protect its data, and they're somewhat at odds with for-profit companies. And so I think that democratization of data is essential, freeing data from department silos so that decisions can be data-driven. I think that is the foundation. But data as a new source of revenue, I think that will be the exception, not the rule, from a city's balance sheet.
Mhm.
There's just too much conflict of interest.
Yeah,
In a
because-
perfect example, when we talk about data privacy, I love San Diego. I love GE, current, now Signify, right? San Diego deployed 3,200 smart streetlights with non-identifiable video sensor data, right? They were counting cars and people. There was no personal identifiable information communicated in the network, but they didn't do a good enough job of community outreach. And so the citizens, a small vocal minority of citizens, got alarmed and shut down a $34 million project over data privacy concerns that were unfounded.
Yes. So you're telling me then that perhaps the city could sell data in the aggregate to marketing firms, and they should stay out of the marketing of data, because, as they said in England, who owns the data? Do I own the data? Who owns the data? Will the city own the data? Will Verizon own the data? Will Samsung own the data? Will AT&T own the data? I think as we move forward, and by the way, Andreas has an interesting proposal to show how data can lift everybody out of the world of poverty. You might want to share that with us. But my question is, that is a serious issue for cities, especially when they're not a private enterprise.
I think it is a quagmire for cities to monetize data. And if you look at what Google was doing in Toronto, at Quayside, right? The large smart development that they pulled out of in February of last year, right? They shot themselves in the foot because they're a data company and they were building this development to monetize data, and the community rejected it. So, it's not a panacea for revenue. It is a great way to improve operations, and it is fraught with opportunity.
Okay. So the city would simply be to protect and to serve and to do those things. We lost George there. There we go. Got to turn it sideways there.
So did we lose George? Or no, Llewelyn? Where's Llewelyn?
That's Llewelyn. So I think George was saying, it's interesting that as we think, say, in management and marketing, that data are more valuable than the product sometimes, that the city data should be reserved for the protection of the individual in the city, making life better for the person in the city, and not the selling of data to marketing firms, the selling of data to other private firms that can help to market what they want to.
Right. And but let's get into some of the details. So George, when a city wants to do something, and there are so many things to do, what's the number one use case? What's the number one thing that they want to do with smart cities? You're muted. You're muted. You're muted.
Okay, now,
There we
so
go.
it certainly depends on what is, they're localized, but you can broadly say that every city, if you don't have a safe city, you can't be a smart city. And crime has been rising across the nation for a year and a half, right? And kind of in lockstep with COVID and the social unrest. And so there is a real uniform need for safe cities without becoming a police state. as I've talked to city leaders over the last year, they have uniformly asked, or the top two, two of the top needs are social equity, closing that social equity gap, and community resiliency, because every community is vulnerable to climate change. It's not just ones on the coast, or let's just call it to severe weather events, right? Fire, flood. I mean, you can be inland and be which city had 36 inches of rain in a year's worth of rain in a day? Right. None of that infrastructure is able to support that, and that puts citizens at risk. And then, right, and so it's outside of the US, it has largely been driven by safe cities, right? But those are let's just be polite and call them non-democratic societies, right? Interested in control. And here in America, it's been more about accessing data, which is good, freeing data out of the silos. But to do that, you have to think and act and invest differently. And really hardening communities to withstand severe weather. Whether someone believes in climate change or not, you still have to harden your infrastructure for severe events. Right.
So it seems like, and it's interesting. We were in an inner city trip, sort of all the chambers of commerce of Central Texas. We went to North Carolina and visited Chapel Hill and Durham and Raleigh, and we were having these conversations. And it's really interesting that I kept trying to bring up the topic of smart cities, and whenever I bring up the topic, they all say, the mayors and everybody, that we're already smart city. We have all these smart things here, smart things there, and to me, it's really interesting that everybody seems to have a soundbite about it, but they're not really doing it. They're not, in terms of like you're talking about, with safety and resiliency and equity and economic development, all integrated, all digitized. I mean, so George, again, from the perspective of, a lot of people say that Singapore is the benchmark. And there are several cities in Asia that are benchmarks, and there are several cities in the Northern European countries, the Scandinavian countries, there are benchmarks. Where do you see the United States in that journey?
I've thought about why the US has not rolled out integrated city scale solutions like Singapore and in Asia. And I've concluded that it's simply because of democracy, right? We have a messy political system, which leads to a lot of diverse opinion locally. In terms, you don't have that central. We outside of Cairo in Egypt, the Egyptian government has built the administrative capital for urban development. I call it New Cairo. It's a city of 8 million people, 270 square miles. In the US, we're not building any greenfield cities, but that entire enormous metropolitan area is run on Honeywell Smart City Tech platform that integrates all the systems and integrated systems from soup to nuts. And the operational efficiencies are staggering. But that was a central government decision saying, we're going to do it, and here's the check. And we're never going to have that in North America. And even in the US, it's a reason why the tier 1 cities, New York, LA, the mayor, the city manager can always ask the police chief to do something. Never going to tell the police chief what to do, right? These are such entrenched silos and budgets and power. And freeing data means sharing power. And so that's a cultural challenge that we've got.
Yeah.
That smaller cities are less entrenched.
Yeah. Llewelyn, what's your take on
I have
this?
a question. First, I apologize. I had a computer problem and went offline. But
Yep.
George, one of the things that seems to me lacking in this equation is demand. Somehow, the people who want, including Honeywell and myself actually, and everybody on this program, who think it'd be very desirable for us to have smarter cities, but we fail to ignite any interest in the public. There's nobody banging on the doors of the State House saying we want smart cities, because we failed to sell to the public any of the advantages of living in a smart city. And we've also failed totally, and maybe there is no answer to it, to overcome this privacy issue, which is important to Americans. But if we could say there will be better this and your life will be improved in 6 ways, but it's not happening. So that we have this situation where the people who are selling systems like Honeywell, the people who want systems like the mayors are on one side, but they're populous. The people who have to pay for it and live with it have not been sold. It's almost like, normally when something new comes along, there's demand for it, whether it's the cell phone or the air conditioner or when it was the automobile. But somehow the smart city has not caught the public imagination at all, and nobody has done anything, I think, dramatic to sell it to the public. It doesn't come up. It's never been mentioned that I know of in a presidential speech. The sales job is appalling.
Well,
I think
agree.
Llewelyn.
Yeah, I agree with George. I mean, it's the same reason why, Augusta is a great golf club, and the average golf club's got a vote for everything. I think that it's like selling stuff to the PTA, trying to get new books in schools, or like trying to change the electric grid in America. I think that in an interesting kind of way, we like to say, well, democracy itself, we need strong leadership. That's our excuse for non-democracy. But I do think it'll be a bit more harder in democracies to carry out. And but so are other kinds of things. But they say it is what it is. And I think that Llewelyn is right. In a sense, it's like the grid. Nobody knew about ERCOT until it went out, right? There are certain things that we just don't think about, and we don't necessarily call smart cities. So it is an awareness kind of issue also. And the other thing is the business models. When you can show cities that they can do well economically by investing in smart cities, that is the technology and the management, I think it'll move along a bit faster.
Yeah. I do think though that again, some of these trends take time to become popular, right? So we're probably on year 12 or 13 of the smart cities movement. If you trace it back to certain events, IBM pitching the early days, the smart cities and things like that, and the Smart Cities Council getting created, and things like that, and so it maybe it's a time thing, and in the next 5 or 6 years, this whole thing will blossom. Just when I trace it back to smart grid, and finally a president is talking about smart grid, in lingua franca in many speeches, even though we have been doing the smart grid for 30 years. But George, give me a sense of the enablers. So clearly this trend is happening in many places. It will continue to accelerate. We are all for it. We're trying to bring awareness to it through this program and many other activities. So let's talk about the enablers. So the enablers are clearly the energy industry and solar rooftops and sort of electric vehicles is an enabler. 5G, telecommunications, Internet of Things is an enabler. The whole traditional smart buildings things that Honeywell has always dominated is an enabler. How do you see or where does Honeywell see the role of promoting this. For example, we don't see advertising of smart cities or a smart city deployment family living in a smart city environment. We don't see any of that. How do you think this is going to play out over time, where a Honeywell and other surrogates push this whole concept, because there are so many good benefits, as you said?
Well, because it made me, Llewelyn's comment about not communicating, cities not communicating these benefits well. What I realized pretty quickly when I started in the smart city space is cities don't have marketing departments. They have a communications department, but their job is they have economic development groups. But in terms of a city promoting smart city, I see that more frequently with private developers and in certain communities trying to create an image of a certain lifestyle. So I think that, and that goes back to the comment I made about San Diego's smart streetlight pilot, that they had to put the brakes on because they didn't have sufficient outreach. And so because they're not capitalist, I mean, cities are socialistic entities. They serve all citizens, which is why they're so interested in equity. I don't think cities are going to be promoting smart city branding because the term smart city is vendor led, right? Andres, we've been living over there for 10 years and, we can thank Cisco and IBM for it. Yep. It means everything. So it means nothing. Right. And so what does it mean to a city? What do citizens want? They want their trash picked up. They want to be safe at night. They want parks. They want a reduced commute. Right now, it takes data to justify some of those investments. And I think we had a question from Scott Perry about data that I think we should also touch on. I do think that citizens trust their local government more than their state and more than their federal government in terms of data. And that's why I think it's very precarious for cities to try to monetize data, because they are challenged enough just securing their assets so they're not, held ransom. Right? Yeah. So that their IT and OT systems aren't held ransom. So I think that the enablers, as you mentioned, there's technology enablers. I think COVID is an enabler. Right. As an example. I think every serious weather event is an enabler in a region because it heightens the citizens' awareness of the need. And so when that bond issue comes around to harden our stormwater infrastructure, to invest in the grid, they're more amenable to supporting those investments. Yeah.
Let me say this. I've seen here in Austin in the early days with George Kosmeskis and others and myself, we reconstructed the Chamber of Commerce. That is, we have a Chamber of Commerce when a company would come to town, they would pay $500 to connect with them. Because the big tech firms, whether it was Dell or IBM, said, well, we have a global firm now. Why should we pay $500 to connect? And we actually switched the Chamber of Commerce to more of an entrepreneur Chamber of Commerce. We had Ann Richards saying, y'all come to Texas, let's come to Austin, and let's create this great commercial situation that we have now. Jordan, my question to you is this. Do you think, given the changes in technologies, and if we can show the business models where the cities will be very, very successful, and if they could guarantee citizens that their individual data, not their aggregate data, not the individual data, that the individual data would be protected, but the aggregate data is okay. Do you see a situation where cities would create business model around the data and change their managerial styles?
Wow, I would say cities change slowly. And so to change the business model is, that's going to be a 12 to 14 foot putt. That's not a 2 foot putt. it's not where I would see change happening first in a city, right? They need to access the city. They need to access the data. They need to unlock that data for better city operations, for better decision-making on policy, on investment allocation, resource allocation. But monetization, you know, I don't see, of all of the city budgets I've reviewed, not one of them is making a nickel from data monetization today.
Mhm.
And so for that to be any meaningful number, right? A city of 70,000 is going to have a $40 million general fund, right? How do
Okay.
you know? And they go up into the billions from there. So how does the monetization of aggregated data achieve any meaningful scale on a city budget? It puts the city at odds with commercial enterprises who want to do that.
Right.
So I just think, as I said earlier, right as I dropped off, I'm not sure, right? I describe it as fraught with opportunity.
So maybe,
Right.
so maybe the city is not involved in that, but the city allows the third party to build all that and gets free services or something like that.
Along the leveraging their public right of way
Yeah.
and the street light poles that they might own to, I think that is a better public-private partnership model where they are leveraging city assets to include city benefit, but it's revenue. It is a slippery slope, and cities are struggling to secure their own systems. If that trust between the citizen and the city leadership erodes significantly, that's not a good thing. That's not a good thing. And there's so much data that cities have about every individual.
Right. So let me do a double check with you on a different way of thinking about this. So clearly, Singapore and other places, top-down decisions. I suspect that the financing of those decisions comes from having money in a strategic fund for a rainy day, or they're raising taxes of some sort, or they have created something that is called, like public innovation districts or things like that. And there's some new financing, sort of like we see when we get a football stadium, there is a new line item that, cities charge for people to enjoy the football stadium, what have you. Do you see telltales of that in any of these cities that are doing these transformations? Are they raising taxes? Are they creating a new kind of income to justify the investment? How is it being financed?
I haven't seen that effective. I haven't seen that emerge yet at any significant scale, because they're really, to achieve truly smart cities, I think two things must happen. You must align the city, the utility, and the developer perspectives so that everyone is rowing in the same direction. And you must create a sustainable business model, right? You need both of those, because without the sustainable business model, you'll invest in technology, and then it will, at the end of that pilot project, it stops. And so one approach that we are introducing, because I've given this tremendous thought, as I mentioned earlier, one of the city leaders, every city's leader is concerned about social equity. And what that has meant is usually digital equity. Let's put Wi-Fi in the low and moderate income household neighborhoods because they need it too. And they're dramatically underserved, not just in Wi-Fi, but across the board, right? Energy is an excessive burden on their budget, right? And so how do you close that equity gap? And what we are solving is a way to do that through what we call an energy equity virtual power plant. It is essentially aggregated demand side management, megawatt hours sold to the utility instead of them purchasing wholesale power at spot or using peak generation. And the way to make that self-sustaining is for the city to put their municipal building stock in a energy savings performance contract that they generally are doing, either doling out a building here or there or splitting it between vendors. But if there's a tremendous amount of value trapped in inefficient municipal buildings. And our approach is to offer them a shared risk reward model where we do those energy upgrades at a open book fixed margin, and all of the savings beyond that get shared disproportionately to the city. But those incremental savings have to be plowed back into smart city programs, in particular the energy equity program, to help the low moderate income households. So it's a way to create a self-sustaining model that doesn't cost any additional cash to the city, and it achieves those goals of closing the equity gap, reducing the energy burden on those LMI households, reducing carbon emissions. So that, it's about the business model, if we bring that full circle.
George, how do you go about selling a city? If you see a city that you would like to be involved with, how do you sell it? What's the first approach? How do you explain that they need it? How do you go in there and do the music band thing?
Well, so I would say glibly, charm and wit, but
you have Johnny on your team.
Yes, I'm teasing. So they're one of my favorite quotes is by oh God, it is he wrote Neuromancer. He's a science fiction writer. The future is already here. It's just unevenly distributed. Okay, William Burroughs. And what that means is there are early adopters of every technology, and things like smart cities. You're never going to push that on a late adopter, right? And so you have to understand who are the early adopter cities, and within that group, what are the pain points within those cities? Is it safety? Is it economic development? Is it resiliency? And then you simply have that, you go to senior leadership, whether it's the city manager or the mayor. And not every company can just open the door of the mayor's office, right? We at Honeywell, we have, the ability to do that. And other large companies can do that. And you just have a very pointed discussion about value and not technology, right? And they've got to, the short answer, Llewelyn, is they've got to pull it, right? They've got to want it. You've got to be solving a need and not pushing technology.
Yeah.
It would seem to me that a beginning to solve this problem that we have in the States would be to really delineate the advantages that the individual can measure. We can't really measure the advantages of new pipes or better flow in sewage. We simply can't measure it. We're very upset if it breaks down, and we're not the least bit interested while it's working. But we can measure walkability. We can measure safety on the streets. We can measure traffic flow. We can measure public transportation and whether it's working. And we can, see changes that are beneficial to us and therefore which we want. But unless we can sell those to the public or bring those to the public attention and link smart cities to infrastructure, I hear all sorts of talks about infrastructure which do not include smart cities. I don't see why there's been a disconnect between smart cities and infrastructure. They're the same thing or a part of the same thing.
Yes, they are. Yes, they are. I agree with that.
Well, I think it's a disconnect because you've got two things going on here. You have the data that we've been talking about, and then the unwillingness to break the trust of the city management with the citizens. So the data will be there. And I think that what you're saying, George, is that the data will be utilized to help the citizens have a better life in the city, and not for the commercialization for the revenue of the city, to put it in a nutshell. Right.
Do we see George, any related to the confluence or the relation that many cities, not the big cities, but many cities, perhaps the 95% of all the cities don't have the staff, the inclination, the capability to doing this, and hence they want to perhaps outsource all this stuff to somebody. So, for example, you're probably incredibly well aware of a movement that is going on in India, has been going on for a while now, where the private sector deploys cities in India. They build cities from scratch. They're run by the private sector. They have a mayor, but the mayor is sort of like an elected, appointed official that works for the corporation. The Tata company does it. All these companies. This is a model that is also used in China, where it's more of a government private sector. But in India, in particular, the private sector seems to be driving the urbanization, if you will, of the country. Do you see that model manifesting itself anywhere else? And do you think that model maybe is a model that ultimately is the only way for this to happen, because cities and their staff just don't have the wherewithal, the knowledge, the technology, the inclination to make this happen?
Well, I would say in that broad spectrum of outsourcing, I don't see private cities in North America. I think most cities are interested in public-private partnerships for toll roads and rail lines, heavy infrastructure, but not the operations of cities. I think that is, for one thing, the margins to the commercial enterprises would not be acceptable, right? Those are not going to be margin-rich operations. And I think that is one reason, right? That's the corporatization of the city. And I think citizens would, it's why they rejected Google in Toronto, right?
Mm-hmm.
That they don't feel the citizen has a kind of a unique and solemn bond with city leaders and vice versa, right? The city leaders represent and serve and protect those
Mm-hmm.
citizens. They're not there to optimize citizen revenue, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a fundamental disconnect, but there is an undeniable trend to outsourcing. You see that with web services, right? You no longer need as much IT, the sophistication. More and more functions are being served by third parties, but I don't see, God, I hope I don't see city corp.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let me give you another model. If you look at what's happening in military organizations, we have an all-volunteer force that outsource lots of things now. We outsource medical, we outsource combat, we outsource operations. And as an old Vietnam vet myself, it was a total institution at that time with the same logic that the military was there to serve. And then we went to the all-volunteer force, which is more than an occupational model. That is, we might expect a unionization of the military, we might expect protests within the military. So my question, would there be a revolution in cities as the data itself become overbearing? And the other question then is, will the cities allow private enterprise to purchase the data or to utilize the data?
I'll start with the last question. That there's going to be certain interest in that. And I am skeptical of its success. And when I say success, I mean if cities were to purchase that data, I just don't think it would end well for the citizen.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just skeptical of the long-term privacy of that data. I mean, we give that data freely to Google and Apple and Amazon every day through in-home devices, through our web browser, through our email, right? We give that individually, but that's an individual opting in to that decision. That's not a city making that decision for its citizens.
Mhm.
Right.
So I'm skeptical of that. Doesn't mean it won't happen. I'm just hoping it happens
Yeah.
slowly.
Yeah.
George, I have a question. Are the cities a little intimidated by the vendors? A little fear that a medium or small city is dealing with a very large company with brilliant lawyers, brilliant engineers, that there's a fear that they'll be overwhelmed and that they will not cut a deal which is in the long-term interests of the city. Is there an asymmetry at the negotiating table?
There's definitely an asymmetry, Llewelyn. That's a great way to put it. And my experience is the cities, if the relationship is strong and positive, those relationships are supportive, but you still have an asymmetry in terms of decision timeline and revenue expectations, right? Startups, big companies, doesn't matter. When they first enter the smart city space, the first cold slap of reality in the face is the decision timing and investment timeline of cities. They do not move on a quarterly reporting cadence, right? It's just a fundamentally different mismatch. And cities love the public-private partnership model, but to really embrace a P3 model means you're not acquiring in a lowest first cost approach, which is the traditional procurement model. And it works for commodity stuff. But if you're partnering on a parking meter concession or an airport concession or any city infrastructure or service, it is so hard to align and to keep aligned those vendor and city interests, right? And you do that with trust, you do that with transparency. That's hard to maintain. I've lived through that. Private enterprises are a little uncomfortable with transparency, and they always want more speed. And then on the city side, the cities and the citizens generally think the vendors are making more money than they truly are, right? And so it's about communicate. It's the simple, soft things of relationship building that are so hard to execute at scale, right? It's not these are almost never technology problems. They're people problems.
Let me ask you another insightful question. So the world is going full throttle around decarbonization. There are multiple stakes on the ground by 2050, 2040, 2030, all different companies, different municipalities, different countries. Everybody's trying to avoid the climate change calamity. Do you see decarbonization as an enabler and a driver of this smart city conversation at all?
Absolutely, because it's driving the smart grid investment. And one thing we haven't talked about, 40% of carbon emissions are transportation related. And so what we haven't had a chance to touch on yet is really the migration to fleet electrification. And how does that impact cities? How does that and whether they're a municipal or an investor-owned or cooperative served utility, it is going to be incredibly disruptive because those are batteries on wheels, right? It's more than just, how can my personal belief is that cities are woefully unprepared for the somewhat rapid adoption over the next 5 years of EVs. The Ford 150 Lightning will open up the EV market to a large part of America that has so far resisted that technology, right? And with it, the opportunity to have a 3 or 4 day microgrid in your house, right? It will fund the electrification of mobility. I think will end up being one of the largest enablers of smart city technology because it's all about transit, electrified transit. So and that's fueled by the need to decarbonize.
Right.
So do you see any variation in cities? We've always thought that some cities move more rapidly than other cities. If you look at, I think we're moving too fast in Austin. But do you see a situation where some cities will comply and others will not? Where some cities will enhance the relationship between data and business models, and some cities will not? Do you see that? Do you see, for the most part, cities as a monolithic kind of category, a sameness kind of category, but do you see variation in how they accept business models?
Definitely variation, and some are rapidly racing to the forefront, and others. I'll give you a perfect example. It will also be guided by state policy. A perfect example in Colorado, the city of Colorado Springs has historically been an extremely conservative / libertarian city with radically low taxes, right? Which constrains the city's ability to invest in infrastructure. But here is a city that is not progressive, not green, not sustainable, not, it's a very libertarian conservative mindset. The state has passed a decarbonization, 50% of decrease in mobility emissions within a decade, right? Radically different agenda that the city has to now comply with or be in violation of new state code. And so cities do operate in a vacuum in terms of they really are centers of innovation. But where the state or the federal government we've lacked federal strategic guidance for a while, but in areas where the state is setting policy and penalties and funding, right, the carrot and stick, then those cities are much more likely to support. But of course, cities are everywhere on that spectrum of early adopter, mid-stage adopter, late adopter.
Okay, good answer. Okay.
Andres, we're at the top of the hour.
Yeah, we would love to keep talking to you, and I appreciate you being with us today. And we unfortunately gotta go. So appreciate you. Thank you for having us today, and enjoy the event. And we'll see you soon.
And George, I will send some of my bright engineering students that's doing smart cities to Honeywell.
Okay, and I'll come visit you in Austin.
Yes, come do that. Come do that. You will love it. Just make sure you leave when you come, because everybody that comes stays.
George,
I live in Denver. Yes,
okay.
George, as a journalist, I have to say to you, don't forget the music, man. You've got to beat the drum.
I agree, sir. Thank you. Thank you,
All
Andres.
right.
Thank you all.
Thank you, George.
Pleasure to be with you.
John,
George.
today.
Bye, Johnny. Bye,
Take
everybody.
care.
Pleasure.
Take us out, John.
Play the
Take us
music,
out.
Johnny.
Operator, why don't you help me face this call? See, the number on the matchbook is old and faded. Living in LA with my best old ex-friend Ray. Gosh, she said she knew well and sometimes hated. Isn't that the way they say it goes? But let's forget all that. Give me the number if you can find it, so I can tell, just to tell them I'm fine and to show. I learned to take it well. I only wish my words convinced myself it just wasn't real.
Excellent. Excellent.
Okay.